Hey there, and welcome to the video. My name's Lockie. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer. It's great to be here with you. In this video, we are going to go through and look at Microsoft Purview's insider risk management workflow. Now, whilst not the only thing we're looking at, we'll also look at things like alerts that are generated, how adaptive protection functions, and just a little bit of the investigation procedures that we have within the insider risk management activity framework. We will be using this as sort of the starting point to get ourselves into the right headspace. If you're following along with the information protection framework, this is part of the Manage Internal Risk Activities component. For more information, head on over to learn.microsoft.com. Now we're going to begin with this management of the workflow. Realistically, this goes through essentially how you actually work within insider risk management once things like policies and connectors are all set up. We'll talk through the key components of how insider risk management functions, what we do to analyze different user activities, assess potential risks, and we'll also do a little bit of configuration around some of the notice templates to notify a user that a policy violation has occurred. Let's get ourselves started. Now, when you work within insider risk management broadly, we need to have a clear play-by-play. What actually happens when we do detect that a user represents a potential insider risk? This is a cyclical process that is going to go in essentially a big loop. So the more we can optimize and improve at the end, the better our detections are going to be, and the better our investigations are, the better we can optimize. Now, we start with the detection through signal gathering. By being able to pull in the right information from the right sources, HR connectors, security signals, these sorts of things, we can ensure that the right alerts and logs get fed through. With sufficient information, we can have properly enriched analysis be achieved. By providing you a range of different reports and dashboards, we can effectively help you prioritize where a high-risk activity has occurred. There's a number of different policy thresholds and even some machine learning models you can use to rank the severity of different risks over time. Once we do have a potentially identified risk, we can investigate cases that are raised. In this, you can go through and create cases to investigate things like user activity and assess different types of forensic evidence that have been gathered from the user's devices. Once this is in place, we have a few different options. How do we notify users? Do we remediate things? Do we need to pass it on to additional teams so they can take action? Ultimately, the case acts as the central point for everyone to then understand what their next steps need to be. And at the end, an optimization phase comes in. This is where we go through. We take the detection data that we used and we see if there's something we could have done better. Is there a way that we could have adjusted our analytics or our reporting to find this sooner? Or maybe to reduce the amount of false positives if we do investigate something and it turns up naught. We're going to go through these one at a time, and I want to start with our reporting component. There is a range of different reports available, and these are really just about giving you as much visibility as possible without you having to trawl the raw data itself. Now, as a starting point, your alerts report should be your fundamental place to begin. At a policy level, this will show you things like severity, location, and what actually triggered a policy. Next is the case report. Once cases are actually put in place, this will give you a summary of the risks that are being presented by those cases. If you're someone who's managing investigator workload, or you yourself are an investigator managing your workload, this is a great way to get an overview of how much is currently on your plate. From there, we have our user activity report. Behavioral trends. So are we seeing a large increase in certain odd types of actions? Maybe that indicates a change in work behavior or potentially that there's some other campaign ongoing. Regardless, it gives us broad insights rather than us having to think at an individual data point level. And last of all is the analytics report. This gives you aggregate insights. Think of this as a way to use a aggregate mechanism for investigating at our optimization stage. Right at the end, it'll give you insights and recommendations about where policies could be improved. You can access all of these by just going to the Insider Risk Management tool and then selecting Reports. The reports generally have a summary at the top to give you some information, and these come in some interesting forms and surface some pretty interesting data insights to you, but you can always view the full details by just hitting the View Details button. Now, the reports themselves are certainly a starting point, but there is actually a couple of additional things that we can feed in to get better information into this reporting structure. Now, the reports provide us great visibility, of course, but there's actually a mechanism that we have to be able to enhance visibility beyond the standard reporting structures. Effectively, if you are looking to go through and get better enrichment on these reports and you're finding not all the information you were expecting is there, you may wish to consider direct browser signal detection. This is utilized directly in Chrome or Firefox via an extension, or if you're using Microsoft Edge, the support is built in. But what it allows us to do is to be able to monitor how someone uses the browser directly. So rather than having to wait for, say, a Defender for endpoint signal that someone is attempting to print sensitive data, we can capture it as they attempt to print it from the browser. As they attempt to transfer files, we can capture it as activities happen within that space. Even down to the use of certain sites, such as generative AI groups. We can use this as a way to capture information where there is potential high-risk activities occurring simply within the browser state. I note this one specifically because there is some extraordinarily useful information here, but it doesn't require the same level of rollout or implementation that a full endpoint onboarding does. So if you're looking for a way to feed in extra risk indicator information, or you want to enhance the reporting structure, consider looking at some of the browser integrations within the Purview stack. All right, now, aside from the reporting, the next one was focused on users. If we actually want to do an investigation on a user, where do we work out that a user has a high risk level? There's ways to calculate this score out based on recent activity, based on heuristics of how they are behaving compared to other employees in a similar space, but we want to ensure that users that are actually put in place can be identified based on that risk level, or based on some type of active alert system, or based on the number of violations. There are a lot of potential different ways we would want to filter a user to ensure that we're basically finding our highest risk activities. There's no one right way to look at this, but low, medium, high in its severity is definitely a great place to start, as well as the number of active alerts or confirmed violations a user has had, either currently or in the past. It's definitely worthwhile going through and adjusting things like anonymization if you need to. Essentially, when privacy controls are on, certain things around the user name will be actually de-identified. This gives you a great way to still support compliance whilst removing the bias of potentially recognizing someone who you may know. This is a difficult role, and we need to try and keep ourselves impartial when we perform these sorts of investigations and look at this sensitive user information. Of course, when we do identify that a user is potentially in breach, maybe they've activated an alert or they've copied something in a place they shouldn't, not every user activity needs to lead to some sort of formal investigation. Sometimes it is just a matter of creating a case and resolving it through a simple notification to teach the user how to use the system properly. Because of the way that we set things up in Insider Risk Management, you are able to create notification templates using simple HTML that will actually essentially notify the user, and we recommend things like clear and direct language, aligning to company notices, even providing custom URLs to a specific piece of documentation to give you a way to just notify people there. Make sure that you are going through, and if there is behavioral things that need escalation, you escalate to HR as required. Part of the best practices for this, ensure that you are tailoring these to each type of trigger. Don't just keep generic templates that keep the user guessing. It should be extremely clear why a template is being triggered. Also, review and rotate the templates frequently. Users become desensitized if they trigger these templates often in the line of just everyday work. So we want to make sure that A, we're adjusting it so we don't get those false positives, or B, we adjust their permissions so we can get them to do their work, And C, we are also going through and providing alternative templates so it looks fresh and people are alerted accordingly. All right, so we've got these abilities available to us, a few little pieces of setup to kind of manage the environment and the workflow itself. But how do we actually get to the point where we go and we start notifying a user? It's not just from creating a case, it generally starts with alerts and activity analysis. We're going to start with just some of the different alerts that come through. There's a number of different avenues we can follow here. We can look at why investigations are actually important, what that actually means when we create an investigation in a case. We'll talk about some of the policy and adjustment settings we can use so you can reduce the alert volume and keep things sensible. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the different risk factors that can influence. Last of all, I do want to also mention things around the Activity Explorer. This is a multi-use case scenario within Purview and can be used for a lot of different roles and environments. So I want to show you how it's used for insider risk. So when we go through and we are generating these alerts, it's important to not panic. Take a breath, and you need to first make sure that an alert that potentially represents a high-risk activity is real. When an alert comes through, go through and do a comprehensive risk overview. Take a look at the activities that have contributed to the alert. See if behavioral characteristics match. Make sure you're going through and looking at things like the order and timing of events. Is there deviations that we have available? There are a number of different tools that you have to be able to work within this space to be able to help you do this sort of work. Once you have your settings configured and your policies in place and an event is actually triggered, we gather all of this relevant information into the alert itself. This effectively means that you can have a very clear set of next steps. Make sure that you go in and you take a look at the details to understand if this alert is actually legitimate. If multiple low-risk activities collectively indicate a higher threat, that's an important piece of the puzzle too. This is why it's not always just about looking at what the highest risk user is, it's also looking at the context under which different alerts are being generated. Now, if you are ending up with too many alerts, we can also go through and tune things. Too many is actually not the common problem that we see though. Often, it's restrictive policies that change how we actually get our alerts through that are the problem. So, how do we go through and increase the number of alerts if we're seeing too few? The easiest way? Add more indicators. If you're able to provide more information that give better indicators about how and why things are being triggered, you can essentially give yourself more information to work with. This could also include adjusting thresholds or even including more users in the scope to ensure that you're getting a wider audience for the heuristic analysis. If on the other side you're getting too many, consider turning certain indicators off, or maybe using analytics to only target certain high-risk indicators or parts of the environment. You could also choose to raise the risk score threshold. This is an easy way to reduce that alert frequency. I'll show you some details in the demo about where you can adjust this. There is a real balance here. Just like we see in other areas of security between security and usability, here it is about security and noise. If we reduce the noise too far, we may suppress significant alerts. But we can also use additional features such as intelligence decisions and intelligence detections to be able to go through and use machine learning capabilities to elevate certain alerts in certain scenarios. Think about what you need to do to adjust to make things work right for your environment. It'll be different for every person, but the strategy remains roughly the same. Monitor, check, validate, and then adjust. Now, as alerts come in, you are going to need to perform this triaging process, the validation that they are real, essentially for each of the alerts. So how do we ensure that we can do this the right way? Well, the alerts dashboard has a number of different features to assist you. You can sort by severity, policy, user, etc. We can look at different alert details. We can even see if there's any particular actions that need to be taken. So we can assign to investigators or escalate to a case or dismiss false positives directly if we find something that definitely isn't a match. But the main thing we need to focus on is what we are going to do to actually drive that triaging process. As an organization, you need to come up with a standard operating procedure about how triaging will function. What are the steps that you're going to take? Are you going to use automation? Copilot is available in this space to assist with the summarization and the understanding of different alerts and how they work. So, is this something we're going to work with? Are you going to use some of the correlation components within user activity reports or case histories to bring in context of a user? There's multiple approaches you can take to influence the way that alerts come through, but as an organization, you need to plan what this triaging process looks like. Just know that the alerts dashboard is the place that you're going to do this sort of analysis initially. Now, once we have identified an alert we want to do further work on, either to ensure validation or to ensure that it is a false positive, we just need to jump into the alert context. Within this, there is a secondary tab called All Risk Factors. This will show you all of the context, essentially everything all at once. This is not just a list. This is designed as a structured summary to give you all of the information you could possibly need to get every risk factor in front of you. It'll start with the triggering event itself, what actually began the scoring activity, the stuff that began all of the things that we're seeing. Then it will go through and look at the user's alert activity over the last 90 days. So is this a historically relevant component? And then start to show different risk factors that are available. We'll start to look at detected actions that contributed, file access, downloads, different pieces like that. We'll pull activity counts, and we put it all into a single spot. Consider this a way to pivot through what we would typically need to delve in the Activity Explorer for, except in a one-page spot that is designed for use within an investigation context. So we always start with our triggering event. Understand that first. We use activity to understand what actions actually contributed to it, which gives us context about how this happened. We can see if there's any other indicators that are relevant based on that alert history. And then we can pivot through the data to see if we can identify the why. Why do we think this has occurred? And do we have a sufficient evidence with what we have so far? There is a couple of other tabs within this space as well. So if you are looking for a more generic overview, feel free to head to the Activity Explorer. Honestly, if you're just needing a step-by-step, a blow-by-blow in the order that these things came in, the event filtering here is totally valid to give you things like timeline visualizations or even to be able to extract data for further analysis in a third-party tool. Essentially, if you need to do additional work and you just want to work with the raw data in a comfortable, easy UI, this is a great place to do things like behavioral analysis and evidence gathering. Now, there are a couple of things to consider when you're using this. The main one is that you should be regularly reviewing activity logs to ensure that you're trying to find emerging patterns as they occur. This should be part of the broader process. So if you're seeing in this activity details a clear step-by-step ABC that occurs, that might indicate a potential threat actor following some sort of coordinated action. We also will want to cross-reference this with other pieces. Don't consider just the Activity Explorer in isolation. It's part of a broader procedure. Now, if you are interested in some additional pattern analysis, you can also go through and take a look at the User Activity tab directly. Within this, we're looking at not just a timeline view, but also the timeline of the user's actions so far. This is very specific and focused on different filtering activities to give you the ability to essentially understand across potentially multiple alerts how a user has enacted actions in your environment. Is there a trend? Are they doing risky behavior over and over? Is there growing risk as they become bolder in their activities or as they aren't being sanctioned for them? This can help if you are trying to work out if an individual alert is essentially an isolated activity or if we're thinking this might be more of a behavioral pattern change. Because of the different filtering options and the ability to dive through the different data points, you can effectively go through, open up any alert bubble, and note the alert bubbles that happen through here. We see a timeline and different activities as they occur, and you can dive deep into the events that happened to actually trigger that alert directly. Because we have that clickable ability to work through the detailed evidence, you can effectively use this as a drill through. So if you're looking for another way to pivot the data and this is more the way that you like to work, consider the user graph as a way to analyze those different relationships there. Even outside of this, we still have more ability to pivot the data. For example, would you prefer a risk that's based on the data graph? The data graph is seeing how not users move, but files do. How files and clusters of activity can represent potential risky behavior. Maybe we're seeing growing risk over time related to a core cluster of files that might identify not only an individual, but potentially a team that has a risky activity more broadly. This can be difficult to identify if we're looking at people in isolation, but this gives us a way to look across essentially the events as a whole. Again, we allow filtering by date, event type, risk category, whatever it is that you need, and each of the data points that you have here can be drilled through into to understand the relationship between different users, different files, different content, and different components of it here. Make sure that when you use this tab, you're using this for context building, because that's ultimately what it's there for. It's a way for you to be able to investigate repeated sequences of behavior and be able to easily identify them in a visual manner. Sometimes just trawling through the logs and seeing the row by row doesn't give us the thing we need. We need something that shows and highlights those relationships. And this is a great way to do that if files are the concern that we're worried about. Now, Purview is not the only place we can work. Of course, insider risks will also be surfaced in Defender XDR if you choose to integrate it. Now, the moment we do this, we are effectively going to be complementing one another. The alerts from Purview become one of a range of different signals within the XDR platform. And because insider risk management is a separate source that we can trigger within XDR, you can actually go directly across there after integration and be able to view many of the different individual signals in a new context. Combine something with insider risk management and correlate it across to, say, broader Microsoft security workload events. Combine it into something like Sentinel, and a security operations center is going to be very interested in who did what, when, and why. The data that we gather in insider risk management and the alerts that actually occur can drastically change an investigation if we are trying to work out why something is occurring more broadly. Once it is over in Defender XDR as well, note that you will have the ability to use advanced hunting queries. This means that we can query the audit log, incident summaries, things like that, using our KQL language, the Kusto query language. So there's a lot of advanced features that we get once we do that integration. If you are looking to do so, feel free to head on over to the Microsoft Learn documentation portal around Defender XDR for more information on how the integration performs. Now, when we go through and we're using XDR and we're using Purview, much of this is focused on either policy enhancement or security enhancement broadly. But if the thing that you are looking to do is actually collate a case against a user in your environment for potential insider risk, you should use Insider Risk Management's inbuilt case activity collation engine. Cases can either be created manually from an alert or, based on a policy configuration, can be automatically triggered. What they provide is a summary of all of the events and the risk indicators that have occurred across potentially one or more alerts. Importantly, though, they provide a mechanism to escalate to an e-discovery case. This is super important because e-discovery cases are how we go through and collate evidence. So over time, we can track behavioral changes and ensure that we have, for legal proceedings or for potential HR proceedings in the future, all of the things they need. Now, once a case is actually created, we can go and take additional steps. For example, Power Automate supports case integration, so we have the ability to trigger secondary or tertiary inactions. We have the ability to go through and kick off something else if we need to, like blocking a user from accessing certain resources or potentially logging them out forcibly from things so they have to re-authenticate. Once we actually go through and resolve a case, there's only really two options. It was either benign or it was a confirmed violation. A case is an escalation. Not all things are going to require a case directly. But if an alert is real, this is the next step. From here, you can start to escalate and work with other Microsoft security tools and other parts of the organization in a secure enclave to ensure that everyone is able to assess this in a very clear and impartial manner. If you're looking to pull things together to be able to go through, this is a great place to begin. When you are closing your cases off, do think more broadly as well, it's worth looking at trends within case closure rates to understand the why a case gets closed and see if we're closing too many cases too quickly or not enough cases fast enough. This sort of thing can give us an idea of what the workload for investigators looks like and how we should combine all of these things together. All right. Now, the last piece I want to talk about here before I start showing a few things in the Purview portal is adaptive protection. Adaptive protection is quite an interesting avenue for us to work because it allows us to be able to do controls based on user risk. In reality, when we are not doing insider risk management investigations ourselves, if we know about IRM, it is because we can use the signals it generates, that risk level that a user has, to influence whether or not other policies in data loss prevention and in lifecycle management, even in conditional access for something in Entra ID, to be able to influence whether a user is able to log in or take an action more broadly. Effectively, it becomes an extremely important signal to ensure that when something happens, we only enact it if it's very restrictive against our highest risk users. So let's talk about how it actually functions. When we actually go through and build this out, essentially we take all of the different actions that a user has taken over a period of time, and we will be able to detect those real-time behaviors, analyzing them for a risk score, low, medium, or high. Now, these risk scores are configurable, and you can adjust things like the actual numbers that represent this, but it's always a 0 to 100. The actual low, medium, high wording that you are looking for is minor, moderate, or elevated, though. It's important to think about it in those terms, even though low risk and high risk is still used colloquially, because an elevated risk is the way to think about a high risk user. It is someone who is potentially undertaking activities that could cause problems. Now, when we see an elevated risk user, we are in for a pretty good scenario here. Simply because a user downloading large volumes of sensitive data outside of working hours. Sure, that is immediately risky behavior, but it may not be something that is immediately triggered, and in fact might be something that is pretty normal for some users in the environment. Using adaptive protection, we can ensure that we are able to identify A, that user does not normally take that action, B, that represents an increase in their risk and takes them to elevated, and C, we can then implement something on the endpoint policies that will block that action. Essentially, we can use this as a way to trigger more restrictive policies, and we can take policies that we otherwise would have to make pretty broad into something that's much more targeted. Now, when you are working within the risk levels, as I mentioned, you can configure these a little bit. It's important to be able to define based on different sort of configuration states here, mostly around how long we want to look at users and how long a risk level actually remains active. The past activity review essentially is how far we look back. So are we considering the last 30 days or just the last 5? Everyone has different behavioral patterns, and each organization will define this slightly differently. Aside from that, we also need to think about how long a user will keep that risk level. So if they do it once, is that it? We keep that up for a month? Or do we go through and refresh that fairly constantly? It all depends on how active users are in an environment and what actions they are typically taking. There's a couple of other settings here, but I'll run through them when we go into the demonstration itself. Now, if you are interested in using the adaptive protection procedures, remember that it is not enabled by default. It is something that you have to turn on. Because adaptive protection involves extremely sensitive collation of information and analysis, you do need to go through and ensure that you understand the implications of what happens when you enable it there. When you go through and actually turn this on, there is an automated configuration that can be triggered, but you can also do this manually. Regardless though, it takes about 36 hours to actually get the risk indicators flowing. You want to make sure this is turned on early. Once it is actually set up and we've gone through either using the quick setup for the default indicators, or we create something custom where you map it to your own risk profile, conditions, etc., Then you need to start going through and configuring on a per solution basis what it is you actually want to incorporate. So for example, DLP policies. If you're interested in using it there, you need to add the user risk level as a condition. If you want to use it for data lifecycle, you need to extend retention automatically for things that a user creates when their risk level is elevated. Essentially, keep the files they create when they might be out the door, something along those lines. And conditional access has a separate trigger when you wish to use this insider risk rating. So make sure that you actually go through and do the 2 steps. The initial setup's important, and of course we need to make sure the right signals are flowing in so we can trigger it, but then separately you also need to incorporate it into all of the other areas that can utilize it one by one. This is a multi-step process, and we typically see it done as a rollout, either in the initial stages of an organizational setup or as part of the kind of later stage improvements. The last thing I want to touch on is just a couple of little management points I don't really have anywhere else to fit. Really, this is just about some of the things that you are going to watch over time to make sure that your strategies are working. First of all, you should really be checking those risk levels. Did the right users fall under elevated, moderate, or risk? You can check that in the risk level dashboard and the monitoring tooling. We also have user detail activity reports split into a few different policy impact areas to understand where certain policies are actually being triggered, at what point they get triggered. Users will have the ability to provide feedback in certain scenarios as well, so it's important to incorporate that. If users are saying, I do this in my normal day-to-day job, why am I being blocked? That's an important signal to understand, or at least go and investigate to understand the why of why that's happening. Ultimately, the end goal here is education. If we can build a secure framework for our users and build out a secure environment with the right protections and guardrails in place, we can make sure that they are protected. And if they are able to work within those guardrails, perfect. But if not, we need to understand the why of why people are hitting those boundaries. Don't consider this a one and done. This is a part of a bigger process and will be a continuous improvement project. So make sure you're improving over time. Okay, let's go and take a look at the portal itself. We're going to look at how Purview actually functions in regards to the adaptive protection policies. We'll set up some DLP and a couple of other places here. All right, let's get ourselves started with a little bit of a practical demo. We're going to go through and take a look at some of the ways in which risk levels are mapped. We're going to look at some of the different adaptive protection policies, and I'll go through and set up a couple of different integrations to show you how all the pieces work together. All right, now that we're back over in Microsoft Purview, we're going to ensure that adaptive protection is all set up. Essentially, once we've got the prerequisites in place, we can continue to use adaptive protection to customize existing DLP policies and give us other dynamic risk-based enforcement strategies across conditional access, as an example. We will start by simply just heading to Insider Risk Management and then going across into the adaptive protection space. This is where we're going to be able to adjust things like our insider risk levels. Remember, risk is evaluated on a level of 0 to 100, but you actually get to adjust the nuance of some of those thresholds if you need to. We can select different individual policies that we want this insider risk to apply to. I'm going to just choose one of my example policies and another one for security violations. And then if we need to edit any of the different sequences around how often things are triggered, whether it's in fact based on alerts, if it's based on high severity alerts versus based on number of actions within it, there is a lot of nuance that we can use to get this into some pragmatic bands to essentially make it work for you specifically. Out of the box, it is recommended to use the thresholds that we have specified as Microsoft, but over time, you will find what works best for you and your organization based on the different setups there. It is also important to consider your activity detection ranges, both in terms of back activity, how far back do you want to look when something is triggered, and forward, how far do you want a risk to be elevated for a user that we determine has risky behavior. At the moment, I've got 7 days back, 7 days forward. So that gives us a fair bit of coverage there, but you can adjust these down to as little as 5 and up to 30 on either side. The last piece is the risk level expiration. When you resolve an alert, what's next? Do we re-evaluate the user back down to neutral and essentially recheck everything? Or do we consider them in the high elevated state until the risk level timeline has expired? All of these settings are important to consider, but it will be different for each org as to what explicitly you need to set. Now that we've confirmed the baseline setup, we're actually ready to go. We've got our minor, moderate, and elevated risks. We can see what the look-back period looks like there, and we've got all of the pieces ready to start actually going through and modifying some policies to utilize our adaptive protection. What we're going to do is pick up a policy that is already existing in my environment, focused on finding and detecting uses of credit card information. And what I want to do is modify this. And so instead of focusing on when we maybe contact external users via Teams, we focus on whenever it is used, but only for high-risk users. So a slightly different piece of nuance. But there'll be an important piece of difference I'll be able to make because I am making that adjustment. Let's go through and edit it now. The large majority of the settings in this policy can remain the same. Name, admin units, locations, none of that needs to adjust. It all comes down to the advanced DLP rules. Here I currently have one for detecting credit card information, something we can detect with a very high level of accuracy due to the way that credit cards use a checksum. We'll hit edit on this policy, and there's only a couple of adjustments I'll need to make to use adaptive protection. First of all, we currently have that if the content contains a credit card number and the user is external to the organization, we can trigger the policy. We're going to add an additional condition to this. And we hit add condition here. I want to select the insider risk level for adaptive protection is. This means that if we do detect that a user represents an elevated level of risk, we can ensure that we are getting the protection we need. Note the ability to block users both from a perspective of a pure block, or we can focus on a bit more of a nuanced approach. We'll select an elevated risk level specifically, so we only want to enact this on our most risky users, but we will ensure that if a risky user attempts to do this activity, we are not going to allow for a blocking of outside the organization. We are going to block them from presenting this information to anyone. This is just a slight bit of nuance in terms of what we can do, but it is a great little adjustment, and it is something that we can use with much better confidence. This sort of action to a standard user would really impact their workflow in their day if this was a valid thing they were trying to achieve. So we might not be able to use as sharp or as harsh a tool. Because we are only focusing on those with an elevated risk protection, we can be much more confident that a high confidence match can happen and that we can take a harsher response. Everything else we will leave the same as for now. We still have this in simulation mode for this moment, but when we're ready to roll it out, we can be confident that we're going to have a really good outcome in relation to our data protection strategy. All right. Now that we're back, we can go and take a look at some of the policies that have been implemented so far. At the very least, I want you to know where you should go to be able to view all of the different types of insider risk policies that involve adaptive protection. Even though it's split amongst multiple potential tools, we do actually have a central place to collate them. We'll head across to the insider risk management solution again and jump back into adaptive protection. Now, within adaptive protection, we start on the dashboard. This will be a centralized place to be able to get information about how everything's put in. Of course, our insider risk policies are there, and you can see what policies are applied in the dropdown. Conditional access, so if you enable it at the Entra conditional access level, that is going to be available in this space for viewing where insider risk management adaptive protection is being utilized. And DLP has a similar setting. In fact, in our DLP section, we can even see the credit card protection that we modified earlier. There is a lot of different things that are available to you here, but if you're trying to get one centralized spot to understand how your adaptive protection is being utilized, this is the place to go. As a way to get yourself started, I recommend starting with your defaults and the thresholds in the loopback settings. There is always a lot that you can consider and a lot of different things that you may wish to change over time. But once you turn on adaptive settings there, get things set up in our simulation mode, tune over time, we can have ourselves a safe rollout that we tune, adjust, and when we're ready, clear user education will get us the last step of the way, giving us that really great outcome with minimal administrative overhead comparative to having to do rules by hand. In this video, we covered a range of different activities focused around how insider risk management actually functions in a workflow. Not the generation of data, but what to do with it next. I hope this has been a good foray to give you an understanding of how the different protection styles and different activities and alerts that we can raise are going to influence the cases and the investigations you do in your inside risk management space. Thanks so much for joining us for this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.